I'm Kevin Elmy. In this presentation, I'm going to capture cover cropping. So when we start looking at soil fertility, it's usually defined by the level of nutrients that are available in that soil. Those nutrients are supplied or cycled through different means. So we can have chemical applications, so fertilizers, we can have manure applications, or we can have biological additions where that's the green manures and crop residues. Research shows that up to 85% of the nutrients that are taken up by the plant have to go through the microbes first. And that's a quote from the call of the reed warbler. What the microbes are able to do is take that nutrient, break it down to a simpler form so that it's able to taken up by that plant and be utilized. By keeping that soil biology alive and active is crucial to successful plant production, and that's whether it's cropping or for grain. We need to have those active root exudates. We need to have the living roots in the soil. This is how we keep our soils alive and functioning. So cover cropping is the practice of growing plants that serve to protect the soil, adds plant diversity to that rotation, and extends the time of a living active root in that soil. Some of the examples of cover cropping types are relay cover crops, where you'll grow two crops together with the intent that you'll harvest one, and the second one will continue on growing after that first one is harvested. There's a nurse cover crop, and that's usually associated with forage establishment. So you're going to grow a crop that will grow above that other crop, where once again, similar to the relay cover crop, you'll harvest that nurse crop with the intent that the stuff underneath is going to continue to grow. We can have nitrogen fixation crops, so green manure crop. We can have smother crops where we're growing something so it grows nice and thick so it suppresses the weeds. We can have a full season cover crop where its intent is to grow it in the spring and continue growing right up until freeze up. And a capture cover crop, and that's where we're going to just focus in on the rest of this presentation. So your capture cover crop, it's basically a cover crop grown with the intent of tying up any free nutrients in the soil after harvest that are being released by decaying plants or manures, or just tying up those free nutrients. It can be either a short term or a long term tie up, depending on where you manage your carbon to nitrogen ratio. And the importance of that is the when your carbon to nitrogen ratio is relatively small, that residue is going to rot quickly and be released. If you have something with a wide carbon to nitrogen ratio, it's going to take longer for those microbes in the soil to break that down to re-release those nutrients. Which one is correct is going to depend on your management. So in the picture, there's a picture of some tillage radishes that were grown after doing some alfalfa hay breaking. So that was seeded in the fall. So the intent was that was going to grow, tie up any free nutrients that we're going to establish, help compete with weeds, along with some other benefits. But the whole idea was to capture those nutrients that was being released by that rotting down alfalfa. So this is going to be, a catch and release of these nutrients. We want to minimize these losses. So if when in this case, I went in and I did some tillage to break up this alfalfa, and then it sat bare for the winter and the next spring. Those nutrients that were sitting there potentially would be either lost through leaching or volatilization or erosion. So we want to cover that ground. We want to have that living root. We want to tie up those nutrients. And then in this case, I was wanting them to release fairly quickly. So that tillage radish top is going to have a high protein content, which usually indicates that our carbon to nitrogen ratio is fairly low. That means it's going to rot quickly. The next year I seeded corn into it. And then those plants, when they're rotting, they're going to feed that corn plant for that next spring. When we're looking at Once again, these nutrient additions, whether it's chemicals, so chemical fertilizers, whether it's manure, or if it's green manures, it is the same process of what how the transformation from being in that initial form into a plant available form. It has to go through a plant or through biology to get into the plant. So when we look at the chemical fertilizer system, cover crops can be either seeded in the spring or late summer as it's needed. We still want to tie up those excess nutrients that are in that soil, and then this way, once again, that catch and release. So it's going to capture it, put it into plant material. The plant's going to die, and then that plant is going to be rotted down. In this chemical system, having this cover crop is going to be a real good way to add diversity to the rotation. So adding different functional plant groups to that rotation. When we're looking at manure, it can be the same strategy if the manure is spread or directly deposited by that animal. Ideally, you have a living root. When you have a living root growing and you add manure to it, that biology is already working. You have a plant that is a nutrient sink, so that this way you add that manure and urine, then you have an active source to go into. By spreading the manure and then adding the cover crop, the issue is if the manure is put on too thick, then the issue is establishment of that cover crop and potential seed burn. So having that plant growing first and then adding the manure is going to be way more effective of capturing those nutrients. So this way it's not going to be lost. Once again, the picture in that's up, it looks like it's on frozen ground and everything is dead. But if you look closely, there's green leaf there. And so what's going to happen is in the spring that those leaves, they're going to come back to life. We're going to have growth, and that nutrient is then going to be tied up in the spring as that manure starts to rot. When we're looking at green manures, in the past, the quick knee jerk reaction is we're growing green manures for nitrogen fixation. Okay, maybe, but there are some other opportunities we could be doing with green manures instead of just being stuck on the nitrogen fixation. So the biggest question I ask is, what is that goal of that green manure? When we are looking at this green manure, so if it's traditionally a sweet clover, so it overwinters and it's plowed down in June or July, and usually it's accompanied with a lot of tillage. What other options do we have? So going into a normal, and I should have put the normal in quotes, green manure management is you grow a high percent legume crop, allow it to get to flower, disc it in maybe once, maybe twice, maybe three times, then cultivate it numerous times, harrow it to kind of level it out, and then leave that soil black and bare going into winter. Maybe there's piles, but there's usually not a lot of residue out there. The issue is under normal management, when you do a lot of tillage and over tilling, that promotes a lot of bacterial growth. And when you have increased bacterial growth, that does increase your free soil nitrates in that soil. When you have free nitrates in the soil, this promotes a lot of our early successional plants to grow, which we basically regard as weeds. The other thing about tillage is it reduces our soil aggregate stability. So in the picture, there's two little cages in the water. And what I've done is I've grabbed two soil samples. The left one was in a reduced tillage area. So what I've done is I grew soybeans. The next year, I seeded a high diverse blend of some annual clovers, phacelia, pearl millet, and it was underseeded to perennial ryegrass. The cover crop died at freeze up. The perennial ryegrass overwintered, and that's where I went to get that sample for the reduced tillage. Whereas there was a strip right beside the yard where it was right beside the crop, but that's where we drive in and out of the yard. So we just had it as black summer fallow, and you can see that when we put these samples into the water and let them sit, the reduced tillage, it had some aggregate stability. The one with the high tillage, it completely disintegrated in less than 2 minutes. So when we have this reduced tillage and increased fungal components of our soils, we have a lot more stable soil aggregates. So the reason why that we have that better aggregate stability in that reduced tillage is because tillage damages fungi, and that damage reduced fungi components in that soil reduces your soil aggregate stability, which means that it'll fall apart. When you have the damaged fungi and reduced fungi in your soil, you will have reduced phosphate availability because, especially with the mycorrhizal fungi, there is a bacteria that associates with it that solubilizes phosphate in the soil. So that when you have less fungi, you'll have less of this bacteria, and so your availability of your phosphate starts to drop. When you have damaged fungi and you have less fungi, then you have what's happened on the picture on this screen is there's no soil structure. You can see the platiness of it. There's no way to get water in. There's no good way to get the roots into it. It's damaged. It's damaged soil almost to the point where it's almost dirt. So how do we get around having this green manure crop and not over tilling this soil? So some of the ways that we have producers working on it is, number one, mowing. This way you're reducing the particle size so that you're getting something that is a 5 feet tall sweet clover. You mow it down and now you're dealing with small chunks of seed of plant that's going to lay on the soil surface, and that you probably work through it. Opportunity to get in there and graze. Get the animals, once again, to get that manure. You still have the living root, but it's a good way to utilize that and put it back into the soil. The other option is, assuming we can get that plant to flowering, going in with a roller crimper as a really good opportunity. Then, once we've mowed it, grazed it, crimped it, and we have this residue laying on the surface, we need to then get that capture crop seeded in there. And that's where going to, knowing the limitations of your drill. So if you have a press drill or just a regular air seeder with not great trash clearance, maybe we'll have to go out and do some light tillage before to seed into it. If you have a disc drill, then you can do what I did in this picture on the screen. Just went right into this residue with a disc drill, and it worked really quite well. So with this capture cover crop, the idea is to get the nutrients from that green manure back into the living plant. Tie up those free nutrients in the soil, so this way we're not going to lose them or have a chemical tie up. In the case of phosphate, if we have phosphate sitting free in the soil, what's going to happen is it's going to bind with the calcium. And those bonds, those calcium phosphate bonds, are really, really strong. So we don't want to lose it to that fraction. The other thing is, by tying up those free nutrients in the soil, in particular your nitrate, now we're not going to see those nitrate accumulating type of plants like redroot pigweed and lamb's quarters, stinkweed. We lose those. Not only that, we're also building our fungi component in the soil. So when we're looking at designing a blend for a capture cover crop, the question is, how quickly do you want those plants to release those nutrients next year? And that's going to go back to managing that carbon to nitrogen ratio. And the quick and dirty part of it is, when a plant is in the young vegetative stage, that carbon to nitrogen ratio is going to be a lot lower than something that will get to flowering or later. So when we have those tillage radish tops, so in this picture, this is what the radish tops look like that next year, the next spring. So having a high protein, so that means the carbon nitrogen ratio is going to be fairly low. What's going to happen is it's going to rot really quickly, and those nutrients are going to be released relatively quickly that next year. When we have oats that get to flowering, or start heading out, and we get that lignification of that stem, that will indicate that our carbon nitrogen ratio is getting wider. If we allow that cereal grain to get to full maturity so it looks like golden straw, now we're dealing with a really, really wide carbon to nitrogen ratio, which will help add to that soil armor for that for the future in that soil. So designing that, planning how mature you want that plant to get, to then determine how quickly those nutrients are going to be released that next year. The other thing we want to do is take a look at a diversity in a rotation. In the functional plant groups, I use the grasses, legumes, and broadleaf as our main functional plant groups. Within those broadleafs, I use brassicas, non-brassicas, and forbs. Take a look at the rotation, see where you are in rotation. What plants are you using in there? And so not only do we have diversity within those five functional plant groups, then we have the diversity of warm season and cool season species within each. And then within those subgroups, we have annuals, biennials, and perennials. So to be able to add in a lot of these different plants and plant functional groups, this is going to stimulate more and more soil biology, and that's going to activate your soil, and it's going to do a lot of good things for soil health. So to go through some of the main groups, and the big one is using these scavenging crops. And these scavenging crops, they tie up these nutrients quickly. They tend to be very competitive, so they grow quickly. Now the next question is, okay, so you have a plant like these turnips. How quickly do you want these things to die in the fall? If you use something like buckwheat, when you get your first frost on it, it's done. Whereas these turnips, the radishes, beets, uh, those brassicas, they tend to be very frost tolerant. So they need about 3 nights of -9 to kill them. So that will indicate, what percentage do you want to die quickly? Which ones do you want to continue being green? The other question is, how quickly do you want these things to rot in the spring? So once again, you look at the top of those radishes, it's going to be relatively high protein, so that means your carbon nitrogen ratio is going to be fairly low. So these things will rot real quick. So you might be able to even seed right into this without pre-tilling. So your scavenging plants, they tend to be very aggressive. So these were the brassicas, for instance, your radishes, your turnips, kale, collards. Your non-brassicas, your beets, and your buckwheat. And then for your grasses, your annual ryegrass, and then most of your spring cereals. Those are the probably the easier ones to help manage. So if you're seeding in the late summer, early fall, you definitely need to look at that colder frost tolerance if you want to get bigger plants. And ideally, we should have some plant that's going to be green right up until freeze up, or in this case, these collards are sticking through the snow. And it took a long time and a lot of cold for these things to die. And is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, if it's green, it's still capturing sunlight and still leaking out root exudates into that soil. So the more days we can be pumping these root exudates in, the better off we are soil health wise. So your brassicas and beets have very good frost tolerance. Oats to have when seeded late tend to have really good frost tolerance as well. And the neat thing with that and the ryegrasses is when the oats are growing, oats will accumulate sugars in the leaves. And so when that sunlight is coming down and the leaves are capturing that sunlight, and even though it's either freezing or cold, those plants are still accumulating sugar. So it can only leak out so much sugar into the soil, but in the meantime, it's continuing to photosynthesize, so the sugar content in that plant just keeps rising. As it rises, it acts as natural antifreeze. So that's the reason why, those volunteer oats in the fall, they'll still stay green right until October. So that's a real good thing not to do any fall tillage, keep those things growing. Using some winter cereals, r- another good option, as long as you know that these things are going to overwinter and show up next year. Whereas buckwheat, once again, that first frost, it's done. For us, where we started back in 2006 is with tillage radish. I got I contacted Steve Groff and became the distributor for tillage radish in Western Canada. So when we looked at it, good deep taproot, good frost tolerance. I've seen it over winter very few places in Western Canada, because normally you get those 3 nights of -9 and they're dead. And the nice thing with it is, when we see and we look at that picture, there's that's my glove there, so it isn't a baby's glove or something. So they can get fairly large, and they're really good for tying up these free nutrients in the soil, drive that taproot down. Now, looking at that tuber, you can see exactly where your soils have issues with some, whether it's minor compaction or full blend blown compaction. So in this case, there's some slight compaction. In this case, about 6 inches down from the soil surface, you can see where that root bends. So it's a really good indicator of what's happening in your soil. The biggest thing I always talk to people is, that tuber size. You always see the pictures of those tubers that, the size of someone's arm on the internet. And when I see a tuber like that, I usually tell people that they have some serious issues in the problem in their soils. So this tuber size will relate to your your free nutrient availability in the soil. So the more free, especially nitrogen in the soil, those bigger those tubers are going to be. So if you have really large tubers, that shows me that you've been really overapplying the nitrogen in that soil. Soil moisture is the other one that would drive the tuber size. So the more moisture you have, once again, the larger the tuber you're going to have. Seeding rate. The lower the seeding rate, the bigger your tubers are going to be, because now that tuber is going to be taking up nutrients from a larger volume of soil. So if we have 1 per square foot, or we have 6 per square foot, that 1 per square foot is going to have way more nutrients available to it. So I prefer to see a higher seeding rate to ensure that we have a smaller tuber to really do a good job of fracturing that soil. And then the number of days of growth. So the longer those radishes grow, and once again up to 40 days, these things will stay vegetative, and after 40 days they'll start bolting. So if they start bolting, we want to trim them and clip them somehow, and keep them back in that vegetative stage, so that we can keep them rooting down, and keep the energy going down into the ground. So um, yeah, basically, don't expect those typical photographs off of the internet. Ideally, those tubers should be, you know, between 3 to 5 centimeters in diameter, 1 to 2 inches. And the quick rule of thumb is it should be a 5 to 1 ratio of diameter to length of that tuber. So when we see that, these are the things that we're looking for. So I want to see, something that's not overly big, drilling down and seeing where those compaction layers are. So when we have hard soils and we have high nutrients, so whether it's manure, green manured, or falling pulses, you may see the tops of the tubers pushing out of the ground. And basically, what's happening is that tuber is soaking up so much free nutrients, and the moisture is good, but you have that compaction layer down below. So the root is not able to push down through that compaction layer as fast as that tuber is growing. So then you'll start seeing it push out of the ground. The picture on the screen, this is a picture from someone from Ontario that had phoned me up, and they said the radishes didn't work. So I said, okay, so tell me more. They said, well, they went and they seeded some silage corn, and they put down the recommended rate of nutrition. So I said, okay, so what's the seeding rate of the corn? What was the tons? And so everything correlated there. And so I was wondering, why were these things sticking so far out of the ground? Then I asked if the person put any manure on there, and they said, oh yeah, we put 15,000 gallons of dairy manure on that, along with the full chemical fertilizer. So basically, they put enough manure on there, so they didn't need to put the fertilizer, but they did anyways. So there was so much free nutrients in the top 6 inches of that soil that those radishes just went crazy. And then once again, you look at the seed density, the seeding rate was extremely low, so that this way we didn't have enough of those tubers to soak up that free nutrient. So then once again, they pushed out of the ground. These are the things that I see. This is what I've recognized. On the positive, those big tubers sticking out of the ground, it soaked up a lot of that free nutrients in that soil and is storing it. So then it's going to be available for next year. Looking at turnips and beets, similar to the radish from the standpoint of their scavengers, but with the turnips and beets, they're dealing with a bulb than a tuber. So they're not going to be pushing down into the soil quite as deep, but the taproot may be going down deeper. Depends on what you want to do. When you look at what the differences are, the radishes are going to bolt after 40 days of growth, whereas turnips and beets, they're both biennials, so you can seed them early in the season, and they're going to stay vegetative right up until freeze up. And once again, most likely they're not going to overwinter. The real big advantage that the beets have, whether it's sugar beets or fodder beets, is they will tolerate flooding and they'll tolerate higher rates of salinity in the soil. So that's a big claim to fame there. So the third big deal about beets is they're a different family. They're not a brassica, and so they are not affected by flea beetles. Whereas turnips and radishes are going to get eaten by flea beetles. So there's going to be pressure there. When we're doing, if you're just going to go with a straight brassica, or if you're going to be going with beets, I still recommend having a grass in there. Whether it's oats, ryegrass, if you're looking at annuals, or winter triticale, winter wheat, or perennial ryegrass as biennials. To throw in sunflowers and flax as a non-brassica broadleaf, both of those are highly mycorrhizal, along with the rest of the grasses, because when we're looking at the brassicas and the beets, they're non-mycorrhizal. So the mycorrhizal fungi are not being supported by them. So to throw in that oat, or like sunflowers or flax, it's a good way just to keep those mycorrhizae active and keep building those numbers. So the key in my mind is to have something growing right up until freeze up. Whether you have it winter kill or you have it over winter, depending on what your goals are. But to have something green in that soil in the fall solves a lot of our issues in agriculture right now. It gives you an opportunity with these capture cover crops to add more diversity to our rotations. It helps build our soil health because we have those root exudates in that soil. We have those microbes alive and we're keeping them healthy. And it also allows us to cycle these nutrients through a plant so that chemistry doesn't tie it up and we don't lose it through leaching, through erosion, through volatilization. We keep that, all the stuff that we're working on to build, we keep it in our system that is going to be functioning normally or naturally. So the capture cover crop definitely has a place in a lot of these management systems. So I hope you enjoyed the presentation. And if you have any questions, here's some contact information. You can get hold of us.